So this is the agenda for the webinar. We're going to have an overview of the Nissan 370Z tuning suite. We're going to have a section on the fuel and the ignition control, section on the throttle and torque control. We're going to cover the RaceROM special features, and then a section on custom maps, what we can do and what we can do with them. EcuTek's Nissan 370Z product supports all Nissan 370Zs from 2008 to the latest 2016 models. This includes the Nismo editions. The only thing I would say is the very early 2008 models were only a 1 megabyte ROM, and we simply don't have enough space in the ROM to add all the features. But the majority of the ROMs are all 1.5 megabytes, and the latest RaceROM feature file update has enabled us to put all the RaceROM features in all the ROM files. Also supports the Infinity 370Z models. They have the same VQ37 engine, and this model's like the Q40, Q50, Q60, G37s and M37s. We support manual and automatic gearbox models, and we support all models worldwide, JDM, US and European. Quite a few tuners, when we've done training events, don't realise the special tools that are included in ProECU, and most importantly the ProECU retail kits also have access to these special functions. Special functions can offer functionality like ECU reset, which clears any idle learnings and fuel trims. It does idle learning, which will balance the throttle bodies and the airflow to achieve good idle stability. Offers cylinder power balance, where you can disable individual cylinders where required. Maybe if the car's a misfire, you can work out which cylinder it's on. And it also has a fuel pump tool to turn the fuel pump on and off for testing. If you think the pump's dead, you could turn it on and off while the car's running, see if it makes a difference. The special tools menu is accessed from Tools, Manually Select Vehicle, Nissan 370Z and ECM Tools. You can see here quite a simple menu: ECU reset, idle learning and cylinder power balance. ProECU also includes DTCs. We can read and clear DTCs on all the different modules on the vehicle: engine control module, transmission control for the automatic models, HVAC, automatic for the air conditioning, body control module, power distribution and the pop-up hood. This functionality is also included in the retail programming kits. ProECU help is quite important. We spend a lot of time with the help files. They can be accessed directly from ProECU, or they can be accessed using Windows Explorer and go into the EcuTek ProECU help folder. The ProECU 370Z tuning guide has the map descriptions and most importantly the tuning advice. It's the sort of things that you tuners will be asking, and it's covered in the questions and answers, as well as more specific descriptions on setting up custom maps and which ROM to use. More in-depth questions are shown in the questions section. For custom maps, there's a dedicated custom maps manual that covers custom maps. We can't put everything into the 370Z because some of the information is generic and may cover other products like the BRZ FRS, GT86, the Subaru DIT and the Nissan GTR. We spend a lot of time writing the tuning guide and the custom maps manual, so please take some time to look through it. What we'll cover today is already covered in the tuning guide, so it can be used to cross-reference whilst the webinar is live. RaceROM offers custom data logging. This is quite important. It enables us to log the ECU much faster than the factory Nissan protocol. We have a high-speed sampling rate of 50 Hz, 50 times a second. RaceROM importantly brings up to 70 new data log data logging parameters that are not available with the factory tool. The Nissan diagnostic parameters are pretty poor, and they don't even have things like knock retard shown. So the RaceROM parameters are very important to enable you to do good tuning. The origin view shows at a glance whether you're logging an EcuTek parameter or a Nissan parameter. Many people are not aware of this functionality in ProECU, so when we're looking at the live data parameters here, if we right click on the name bar, you show that you can add and remove certain fields. When we left click and add origin, we can see a new column has appeared, and OEM is a Nissan parameter, EcuTek is an EcuTek RaceROM parameter. If we click the tabs, we can order them in preference. So we can see here all the ones in red are EcuTek parameters, the ones in green are Nissan parameters. This is the default logging view. If we we close the default list, we open all parameters, you can see all the ones in red here are the EcuTek specific parameters, and in particular all the custom maps ones are shown, and we lead on to more important parameters like per cylinder knock, the VVT and VTC and VVL control, G sensors, engine load calculations, map tracing, torque demand values, steering wheel angle, and wheel speed sensors front and rear, as well as wheel slip ratio calculation. This is all done by ProECU, this is all done by RaceROM, and is available to be logged as and where required. The default login list again shows important parameters like injector duty, so we know if we're running out of injectors, map tracing, mass airflow calculated from the MAF sensor and also from speed density, as well as outputs of the SD map and the VVL, duration, compensation and the SD map. Quite a basic level, but RaceROM feature files, the latest RaceROM feature files from a recent update are now available on EcuTek Update, and they're stored in the 370Z folder. We occasionally update the RaceROM feature files like we have done recently, and it's important that you use the latest version that's available from EcuTek Update. There's improvements, bug fixing and new features added, so it is important that you choose the latest one. The latest version is currently version 2.1120. All the features added from the RaceROM feature file are shown in the RaceROM, are shown under the RaceROM tab here. Moving on to the maps, Nissan 370Z fuel maps. EcuTek's rewritten the fuel maps with 4 high resolution fuel maps. They can be used for greater range and accuracy. We have injector scaling, and we also have the fuel consumption meter calibration value. This will be used when we have larger injectors and should be recalibrated according to the size of your new injectors so that the fuel consumption display remains correct on the vehicle. Maps by function. Fueling, we order by user level, and we can see the fuel consumption calibration byte is here, standard injector size. The high resolution fuel maps are significantly bigger than the factory fuel map, and you can see from this example at the top there is the factory fuel map, and then below is the RaceROM fuel map, and we have 4 of them, 1 for each map switch mode. Not only is the map larger in size, offering more resolution, it's also got a higher engine load, and this value can be increased. So for forced induction cars, turbo supercharged cars, we're no longer limited by the limitations of the factory fuel maps, the factory engine load. Factory fuel map not used. As soon as we've applied the RaceROM feature file, this fuel map doesn't work anymore. Map switch mode 2, Map switch mode 1 will be used by default. If you don't enable map switching, this is the fuel map that will be used. We can increase the resolution of the fuel maps, how many decimal places we can see, by few significant points or more significant points. This is a shortcut key, Control F and Control M. So depending on the size of your screen, Control F for fewer, we can make it smaller, and more, Control M, we can see more decimal places. This is quite important on larger maps, and especially maps which have a lot of resolution, and you might be looking at 4 decimal places. It makes it very difficult to visualize. One other thing you can do if you can't get the whole map on the screen is you can right click on the map and you can open it with a flipped axis. The map is now shown, X and Y have been flipped, the map shown the other way round. Ignition maps. The ignition maps have also been replaced by 4 high resolution ignition maps. We now have a dedicated intake air temperature compensation map. We also have a checkbox for enable dynamic advance. The factory ignition has the ability to add ignition timing in the event of no knock. With the RaceROM ignition maps, we retain this functionality, and we can choose whether it works or not under the RaceROM section for enable dynamic advance. The factory ignition timing maps are still shown, but they're not used. The factory ignition maps are based on cylinder pressure and flame front speed calculation, which means that the ignition map looks nothing like the final ignition table value you would see. So EcuTek has converted the ignition to real values, and they're the values that you will see on your ignition timing. The factory Nissan values are an ignition offset. They're a compensation. The ignition timing is calculated live by the ECU, and then the octane adjustment map is used to adjust that final value. It makes it very difficult for calibration, so one of the very first things EcuTek did is rewrite the ignition maps and provide 4 large size high resolution ignition maps with real ignition timing values. Again, we have one for each map switch mode. We also have the ignition timing compensation for air temperature, so it makes it very easy with things like forced induction cars to apply ignition retard for high intake temps, or charge air if you're using a blow through situation. Showing again the size of the factory ignition map versus EcuTek's RaceROM ignition maps. Knock control. We've got 4 maps to enable and disable knock control against RPM and engine load. We've got per cylinder knock login, we've got per cylinder knock threshold login, and we've got per cylinder knock threshold map adjustment. The 0 indicates knock detection is turned off, and the 1 that it's enabled. So if you had a particularly noisy engine, maybe at high RPM, you can disable the knock correction at high RPM by changing the value from 1 to 0. The knock detection's not going to work now at 6,800 RPM. We've got 4 maps, 1 for each map switch mode. We have knock sensitivity, so we can define the point at where knock is detected and when the ECU will start to retard the timing. This is shown on page, I'm just checking the tuning guide for ignition timing. This is shown on page 33 of the 370Z tuning guide. So what we can see here is the threshold, the yellow line and the purple line are the threshold for each cylinder. So we're looking at cylinder 4 and cylinder 5 in particular here, and you can see the knock noise for each cylinder is also shown. So that's the cyan colour and the red colour, and you can see that occasionally the red and the cyan have breached the yellow and the purple, in particular here around 2,900 RPM, and at that point when the threshold is breached, you can see the green line, which is knock correction, has become negative. Now the reason knock correction is knock correction and not knock retard is because ignition correction can add time in as well as remove it. So it's not knock retard, it's ignition correction. As the per cylinder knock for cylinders 4 and 5 breach the threshold, you can see the ignition correction becomes active and initially applies a -2. Around 3,500 revs there's another knock event, and we can see the timing steps down further, and then at higher RPM around 5,000 we've got quite a lot of noise going on. We've got a big red there around 5,000 RPM, and you can see that the knock retard then steps down probably -3s and -4s. So what we're looking at here is the yellow and the purple line is the values here, and cylinders 3 and 4 have a higher threshold than cylinders 1 and 2 and 5 and 6, and this is because cylinders 3 and 4 have been filtered in a different way and are actually more noisy and need a higher threshold because they're surrounded either side by a cylinder. They're surrounded both sides, they're trapped in, so they have a higher threshold. So if in particular you've got one cylinder that's noisy, you can adjust them individually, although from my experience we generally increase all the cylinders by the same amount just to lift the noise. If we've got a built engine, maybe it's got pistons in it and they're just causing too much noise. Logging the per cylinder is a case of going into all parameters and going down to the per cylinder knock. So you can log the threshold of each one and you can log the knock of each cylinder individually. Shown here 4 knock maps. You can see the one on the right has had knock detection disabled at high RPM. This can help you make more power. Obviously be aware that when you are turning off the knock sensor that you need to ensure the engine is not knocking once we use some knock detection device. So this again, the screenshot, page 33 of the tuning guide, you can see the knock threshold clearly shown. Camshaft control. Now as we all know, the Nissan 370Z has quite an unusual cam control. It's got VTC, variable timing control, and VVEL, variable event valve lift. So EcuTek's spent a lot of time understanding how this control works and provides very detailed control as shown in the screenshot here. So there's certain maps that you'll see at the top here, cam timing, do not adjust. So these are the maximum advance and the maximum lift. As you can see from the description field that we've added in this screenshot, we do not recommend that you change these. If you change these limits, you're likely to have the valves hitting the pistons. So that's why these two maps have been separated out so that you can't over advance the time and you can't demand too much lift and risk damaging the engine. So you can see from the VTC, the valve advance, that we have all the key maps that are needed to adjust the valve timing. You'll also see that the VVL, we have all the VVL maps required for tuning as well. The description defines how each map works and enables you to calibrate it as required during your tuning. Throttle control. EcuTek's defined the torque demand, so that's how much you ask for with the accel pedal. Torque actual, This is how much torque the engine thinks it's producing, and that's calculated from mass airflow and engine load. We've got a maximum allowed target for throttle angle, and we also have the accelerator pedal to throttle angle maps as well. The importance of the torque maps is the torque maps are important for automatic transmission vehicles. Changing the demand is not really going to make the car any more powerful. Ultimately the car is going to produce what it does, but the torque actual map is very important for gearbox control. The main issue that people will face is that when they have something like a larger MAF tube and the airspeed is slower, if the MAF scaling is not accurate, then the engine load will not be accurate and the torque value given to the gearbox will not be accurate. Basically, if you reduce these values by 30%, the gearbox, the automatic gearbox, will become sloppy, it will slip, it won't lock up properly when you're changing gear. If you increase these values, for example, by 30%, the gearbox change will become very hard, very positive, locking up, and feel more binary, more on and off, like we have a racing clutch, for example. I'm not suggesting that you add or take away 30% from these maps, but it can be used to influence and tweak the gearbox control. So if you find the gearbox is slipping, it's not changing gear nicely, increasing the torque values in the torque actual map will start to improve the gearbox lockup during gear changes. One of the important things on the 370Z, and this only seems to be in some regions and particularly on our European model, is you don't actually get full throttle at low RPM on the European 370Z. And you can see the example on the left hand side here is showing where the green line is accelerator pedal, the cyan line is the throttle position sensor voltage, and you can see at low RPM the butterfly doesn't open fully. We've removed the low RPM limiter and you can see afterwards that we get full throttle at low RPM. Just incidentally, when there's a trustful map, just as in the Nissan GTR, we have to set both maps the same. So if you do change torque demand, you must change the trustful map to be exactly the same. The ECU's checking both the maps, and if one of them is different, you're going to get a fail-safe condition and a DTC. There's a torque multiplier map, torque demand multiplier, which will multiply the value coming out of the torque map, and that's used in particularly at low speed to increase the torque output to ensure the gearbox is locking up quickly and tighten up the torque converter so it doesn't slip too much. You saw in the screenshot that we have a description field. Describing how the maps work. There are additional maps here in beta. The torque control is very detailed. We spend a lot of time and effort understanding the control, but there's just some conditions that we can't define each time. So quite often if you find that the throttle doesn't open fully, then it's likely to be one of the other maps in the ECU that could be used. This could be something on an Infinity, maybe a Q40, Q60. So if you find that the throttle's not fully opening on your Infinity for some reason, there's a good chance that for some reason it's using the second set of maps, and that's why they've been included in the software so that they can be adjusted as required. Okay, I'm just looking on the tuning guide to see what page this is on. Okay, so that's page 38 of the tuning guide, and you can see where we've adjusted the torque maps, the torque filtering maps, and also the axle to throttle maps. So as we go back, excuse me, so page 38, the torque control defined, the screenshot we've just seen in the presentation, and the torque filtering maps. Throttle target maximum and the torque filtering. Throttle target max, the threshold that stops the throttle opening fully. You also see there's relationship maps between axle pedal and butterfly opening, and in particular, which is the one, why Nissan make it so complicated I do not know, but basically this is the relationship between the accelerator pedal and the butterfly opening, and you can see that the relationship's actually, it creates a concave map. Now it's not the best tuning in the world, but as an example, if we were to interpolate between these two, you'll see the map becomes very flat, and you'll see that for 35% accelerator pedal, instead of the butterfly being open 15%, the throttle butterfly will now be open 27%. It's a trick that some tuners use, and it can make the car feel faster, it can give a better response. It can also be used on forced induction cars, on supercharged cars, on turbo cars. If you're getting too much boost at lower RPMs, you can use the relationship between the axle pedal and butterfly opening to stop the engine creating too much torque at part throttle conditions and at full throttle conditions if you need to keep it back. Where there's trustful maps, the trustful map has to be set the same as its main map. If you change one without the other, then you'll go into a fail-safe condition. So wherever there's a trustful, set both of them the same. Again, there's lots of different maps for lots of different conditions depending which vehicle type you have. There's eco buttons on some models, there's snow, there's sport. Infinity has lots of different buttons for lots of different modes. It's going to swap between all these maps. So you may well find something like a 370Z, a non-sport model might only use two of these maps, slow and fast, whereas something like a Infinity with all the sport mode buttons, it's swapping between all these maps. So it will need a lot more calibration to get that working correctly. Moving on to RaceROM. So RaceROM has many special features. Applying the RaceROM feature file will enable us to have four-way map switching, adjustable launch control, flat foot shift, auto blip, valet mode, knock warning, and per gear rev limits. We also have high resolution ignition and fuel maps, injector scaling for each mode, or temperature gauge hijack, speed density, custom maps, and fast flash. So moving on to the four-way map switching, we can create 4 different ignition and fuel maps depending on the map switch mode. We have instant four-way map switching using the cruise control toggle or the mode integration button, normal, eco, sport and snow on the Infinity models, on certain Infinity models. When we are map switching, the rev counter shows what the current map switch mode is that's selected. There's a video of this on our website and our YouTube channel. ProECU has been configured to make it easy to navigate using the cursor keys, so you'll see that I'm quickly moving around the menus using left and right to open the tree, and we're going to go to map switching. Right, we're going to go down and we can use the space bar to open the map and space bar to close it again. So this is where we enable the map switching. By default it's configured to use the cruise control buttons. On the Infinity we can use map switching against the driver mode integration, so the normal, eco, sport and snow, and you can see the number will indicate which mode we're in. And we can also change how many modes we want enabled. So default is mode 1, no map switching, and we can choose if we want 2 modes. Maybe we want one for race fuel, maybe for ethanol, maybe we want a valet mode, a detuned mode if somebody else is using the vehicle. Simply enable and disable the map switching in this menu. Adjustable launch control. So we can adjust the launch RPM using the cruise control on the steering wheel. The rev counter shows the current launch RPM. While we're in launch we can retard the ignition, we can control the air-fuel ratio. This is while we're in launch mode, but we haven't actually launched, it's in pre-launch. We've also got a progressive torque release after launch. So launch control is only available on the manual transmission models, and to enable launch control we simply check which mode we want it. So we can enable launch control, we have options where we only enable launch control in sport mode, or we only enable launch control when the ESP is turned off. We need to define when the launch control is allowed to work. Launch control will only work when we go over 4.5 volts. When we release the accel pedal, the launch control will be disabled as we drop below 1.64 volts. The launch RPM will change by 250 RPM, and the ignition will be retarded by -20 degrees. So whatever the current ignition timing would be for the current RPM and engine load, it will be retarded by -20 degrees from this value here. Launch control will only work if we're below 8 kilometers an hour. This stops us accidentally engaging launch control while we're driving along. The base launch RPM is 4,000 RPM. This is the change in RPM against time after launch. Time is the left-hand column and the RPM is the right-hand column. This can be used to create a progressive launch. The hysteresis between the launch RPM is 25 RPM, the on-off amount, and the target AFR pre-launch is 11.6 AFR. We can also ensure that the launch control is only allowed to be enabled when the coolant temp's over 60 degrees and below 100 degrees. If you want to change these settings, you can simply change these in ProECU. Right click, close all maps. Flat foot shift and auto blip. Full throttle gear shifts, ignition retard during flat foot shift, and auto blip when downshifting. To enable flat foot shift, we simply turn flat foot shift on and choose the mode that we want it to work. Flat foot shift, we can choose to only enable it in sport mode if we choose. To various settings, we can have an activation and deactivation delay. Again, we have an RPM hysteresis for the on-off of the cut during the flat foot shift. We have an ignition retard, which is also -20 degrees, so 20 degrees will be removed from the current ignition timing to reduce cylinder pressure. Flat foot shift will not work below 40 kilometers an hour. We have a rearm delay of half a second, so that half a second has to expire before we can rearm the flat foot shift. We have an RPM delta when we enter flat foot shift, how much the current RPM will change, and typically it will increase. If we were at 4,000 revs to a flat foot shift, the RPM will go up to 4,200 RPM and be held there. At higher RPM this comes down nearer the rev limiter, and if we're over the rev limit for any reason and a flat foot shift is performed, then it will wait for the engine speed to reduce before the injectors are restored. We can also control the air-fuel ratio during the flat foot shift, and the target is again 11.6, keeping the air-fuel ratio nice and rich during the shift. Auto blip is not a feature available on the 370Z on most models. It has a auto blip feature as standard from Nissan, and the Synchro models will in sport mode automatically blip the throttle during gear shift. Valet mode enables us to produce a low power mode for when the car's out of our control. Maybe if it's been given to a girlfriend or one of our children and we want to reduce the power, maybe a friend of ours, we want to turn the power down, we can simply put it into valet mode and it will reduce the power. We can set valet mode up. It's configurable for speed, torque and distance. The latest version of RaceROM valet mode is much more simple than the previous version. You can enable valet mode with the checkbox here. We have the speed limiter and the torque limiter against distance, so we can configure this as an anti-theft mode as well if we wanted to. To enter the valet mode, we simply go into map switch and we map switch all the way around to 8,000. When the rev counter goes to 8,000, it's valet mode enabled. To come back, we simply go into map switch, come all the way back to 3,000 or 4,000 RPM, mode 3 and mode 4, and we're back out of valet mode. You can see in this particular example our default values are all the way 5 kilometers, 50 kilometers, 500 kilometers. The vehicle will be allowed to do 80 kilometers an hour. It can get to 80 kilometers an hour using a maximum of 200 newton meters of torque. So it kind of half the torque and only 80 kilometers an hour, 50 miles an hour, that's as quick as the car can go. We have a knock warning and a per gear rev limit. So the knock warning will flash the check engine light when a knock event occurs. The knock value can be calibrated by the tuner in software. We can set a different rev limit in each gear. Could enable us to stretch the engine slightly more in first and second gear to hit critical 0 to 60 times. We can also configure a different set of per gear rev limits for each of the map switch modes. Knock warning, simply enable knock warning, and the threshold, so 3 degrees of retard. So if the ECU was to retard the ignition time and the ignition correction was to show -3 or greater, then the check engine light will flash for a few seconds. Limiters, and we have a per gear rev limit of 1 for each gear and also a set of 1 for each mode. The thresholds are on and off for the RPM. As discussed before, RaceROM offers 4 high resolution ignition and fuel maps. The ignitions are 24 by 20 versus the factory 16 by 16. We've got a new 2D air intake compensation. We've got the 4 high resolution fuel maps. They are now 24 by 20 versus 8 by 8 for the factory fuel maps, so a lot more resolution there. And we've got the 4 injector scaling values providing simple ethanol calibration. So fueling, injector scaling, we have a different injector size for each map switch mode. So we could say map switch mode 2 It's calibrated for ethanol, and we can change this injector size accordingly to get 25-35% more fuel as required. Oil temperature gauge hijack. EcuTek offers you the ability to drive the oil temperature gauge that's shown in the center console on the top of the dash there. So we can drive the oil temperature gauge either during map switch or all the time. We can use the oil temperature gauge to show fuel trims, air-fuel ratio, lambda, or ethanol content ratio. I have a small video to show you later. I'll save that to the end. It's actually on our YouTube channel, but it will show you our 370Z showing fuel trims and AFR, and it will take around 2 minutes, so I'll save that to the end. So we can also use the oil temperature gauge to show boost pressure, maybe a target pressure using the RaceROM controller. So we've got a lot of functionality for the oil temp gauge. One of the key things to mention here with the oil temp gauge is the US cars are in Fahrenheit, and I think it starts at 130F to 240F, something like that. So it's not, doesn't work as well as the European cars, which use Celsius, where we go from 70 to say 150C, where things like fuel trims, when the gauge is set at 100, it's a bit more relevant to what the real fuel trims could be. But that doesn't mean that we can't use the US gauges, and if somebody was super keen, they could make some new gauges. There's lots of company out there will make new fascias, or source a European or JDM oil temperature gauge which has a new fascia on it. It's certainly possible. With such a cool feature showing things like fuel trims, AFR or ethanol content ratio, it would be good to make some gauge overlays, and anybody who does make some, please let us know, because I'm sure other people would be interested in buying the gauge overlays. Oil gauge hijack we're going to cover later in custom maps, and we're going to show you how to set a few of these up. We've got some examples on EcuTek Update that we've created, and they're also documented in the 370Z tuning guide to show you how to get these working. Hybrid speed density. EcuTek offers speed density for the Nissan 370Z. It's a 24x21 volumetric efficiency based map. Its axis are engine speed and manifold absolute pressure. The VE calculation is against charge air or intake air, and you can define which one it is. We've got a VVL compensation for accurate part load calibration. Without the VVL compensation, we simply can't have speed density. As far as I'm aware, nobody else offers speed density on the factory ECU for the 370Z, and we are the first. It was a lot of work to do it, but to understand the throttle control on the 370Z and the VVL control at part load condition has enabled us to produce a successful speed density map that works as expected. Not only do we have speed density, but we also have a hybrid option where we can run MAF and speed density. So maybe we have MAF at idle, light load, and then we switch to speed density at higher load, maybe on boost, or we start off with speed density due to poor MAF design. Maybe we've got something like a compressor turbo affecting the MAF signal at low RPM or idle. Maybe the MAF's just too big, the airspeed's too slow to read the airspeed accurately, so maybe we run speed density at idle, and when we start to get onto load we switch to the MAF sensor. And we can switch against RPM, we can switch against mass airflow or manifold pressure. We can define one or all of them to switch the condition. Speed density. To enable speed density, we just turn it on. We can switch, activate below instead of above. So like we said, instead of switching to SD, we can start with SD and then switch to MAF afterwards. This is our speed density map. It's a volumetric efficiency map. The latest RaceROM feature file has a new calibration, and we've made some improvements in the speed density calculation, and the latest version of RaceROM feature file has an updated speed density VE map, and you'll see the values in the SD map are now more what you would expect them to be. typically for the efficiency of the engine, certainly an NA engine. Again, this map's getting quite big, quite hard to visualize. Control F for fewer significant points will reduce the map and make it easier to see the values. More significant points, making it bigger, more difficult to fit on the screen. You can tell RaceROM, what are we doing for charge air temperature? Do we have a fixed temperature calibration? If we're calibrating the engine, we would choose this. We're going to say intake air temperature measures charge air directly. So if we're telling the ECU that intake air is charge air, then we don't need to guess what it is. And in that instance, we don't need to guess what the charge air is, so we don't need this map to do anything. Oh, missed one. F1. So if intake air is measuring true charge air, then we don't need to guess. But if we do not have charge air, then we'd use the fixed temperature. So that means our speed density map was calibrated at a set temperature. In our example, we calibrated the speed density map at 20 degrees air temp, 20 degrees charge air temp. So our base calibration was done with a 20 degree charge air temp. Now, if we cannot measure charge air, then we have to guess what it will be. So this is what the compensation map is. So we know what air temp is because we've got an intake air temperature sensor. So what we're saying is if the intake air temperature is 50 degrees, then we're going to reduce the SDVE calculation, we're going to reduce the speed density calculation by 0.92, which is like 8%. So we'll have 8% less engine load, so that's more retarded ignition and less fuel. More advanced ignition and less fuel. So make sure I say that the right way around. If the intake air temperature is -10, so it's much colder, we're going to multiply the speed density calculation by 1.13, which will add more fuel, and it will also retard the timing more. It's based on engine load, not just on the fuel volume, so that's an important point to note there. So the decision you have to make is, do I have charge air or do I not have charge air, and then set the charge air temperature acquisition method up accordingly. You can also say, you can tell ProECU that the fuel temperature sensor measures charge air directly. If you want to, you can repurpose the fuel temp sensor and make the speed density calculation look at the fuel temperature sensor, which obviously you'd put in the charge air pipe for its SD calculation. Engine displacement is the size. This is part of the speed density calculation. And this is the important VVL compensation map. So this is a compensation for the speed density calculation based on engine speed and the VVL duration, the camshaft angle duration. This is important for the speed density to work correctly, and during light load conditions, when the 370Z opens the throttle butterfly fully, the VVL compensation map will ensure that the speed density calculation is correct regardless of the throttle position. So this is showing the speed density map and the VVL map in the background, which deals with the part load compensation condition where the throttle fully opens at very light load and very low power output. So why do we want to use EcuTek RaceROM? We have many advantages for forced induction tuning. With the simplified ignition maps, the high resolution ignition maps with real ignition timing values, and the high resolution fuel maps rescaled for high load, it makes it very easy to tune the car. Forced induction, put on the supercharger and turbocharger, we already have the scope within the maps to tune for the car at the higher load. Speed density avoids issues like poor MAF sensor signals at low RPM. We can create fail-safe maps, so we can reduce the power output if the car runs lean or it gets too hot. We can create closed-loop fueling and closed-loop boost control, and we can also create a boost limit with a timer if we want. These are unique functions to EcuTek, and they make forced induction tuning on the 370Z very easy and very safe. With fail-safe maps there, if the car starts to run lean, we simply close the throttle to protect the engine. Using custom maps, we've got 16 new 3D maps for you to configure however you want. You can create what you want the new maps to do. You can create compensation maps for pressure, temperature, speed, gear against fuel, ignition or boost. These are just a few of the possibilities. Set them up to work in any or all of the 4 map switch modes and set additional configurations for ESP or sport button settings. We'll go through this in a while. With custom maps you can choose from over 50 input channels and we have 17 output channels. We can choose map activation conditions and we can use timer delays. We can use custom maps as a minimum, a maximum, as a multiplier or as an addition. We can use the output as an integral value that can be added or multiplied. So custom maps, create any map that you want. I'm just quickly going to open a custom map and discuss the various options before we go into how they work. So we've got 16 custom maps. Bad example because this is an example ROM, so it's already been configured. Let's see which maps we have free. So maps I to maps O have been predefined. So if we choose map P, it's blank. So map P hasn't been configured. It's blank. We've got zeros in the map, we've got zeros in the X and Y axis. So we tell ProECU what we want it to do. Let's make a very simple ignition retard for engine speed. So let's say we want the X-axis to be vehicle speed. So we will go down, we will say vehicle speed. Control S for save, Control Q closes the map. And we're going to say Y-axis is going to be, let's say, coolant temperature. Control S, Control V. So coolant temperature, so we say minus 40. Oh, I seem to have some funny function keys. There we go. 120. Minus 40. Okay. And we said this is going to be vehicle speed. So let's say 200. 200. Control I, and we save and close. So very quickly we have vehicle speed along the X-axis, we have coolant temperature on the Y-axis. So maybe when the vehicle is going very fast and the engine temperature is very hot, we want minus 3 degrees. Maybe up to 160 miles an hour we don't need any more retard, but if we're 120 coolant temperature, maybe we want minus 2 degrees there. Not the best example of a map in the world. Below 90 degrees we don't want it to do anything, so maybe we would interpolate like this, and let's have a look. So what we've just created here is 120 degrees coolant temperature. What we probably do is make that one 110. 100 like this. So it's a bit more progressive now, but we would say at 110 degrees coolant temp at 200 kilometers an hour we will move 1.5 degrees. 120 coolant temp we'd move minus 3 degrees. We have created a map, so we have minus 3 in there, and we're going to say, what is the map going to do? We want it to be ignition timing, so we choose ignition timing, and we want to add the value to the ignition timing. So now we will add -3 ignition timing if the vehicle's over 200 kilometers an hour and the coolant temperature is 120 degrees. That's the simple basics of how easy this is to do. So we may want to define what the map is. We're going to say add retard at high RPM and high coolant temp. Okay, so we've now got a record of what this map is doing. But maybe we don't want this map to work all the time. So we're going to say this map only works accelerator pedal, and it's only going to work when we're on full throttle. So we're going to say 4 volts, and we're going to say 3 volts. So the activation for this map to be allowed to work, the activation is accelerator pedal voltage, and the threshold is the top value. The threshold is 4 volts, so the map is only allowed to work over 4 volts accel pedal voltage, and it will stop working when it drops below 3 volts. We also have some other settings. The map is always active. We could say that the map we need to set this map as it's only active when it's above the threshold, and we want the map to activate and deactivate as normal. We don't want it to be initially inactive and then once activated that it stays active until we turn the key off. That might be something like if we had a drop in oil pressure, something like that, some fatal condition where as soon as oil pressure drops below 1 bar, over 5,000 revs, we want to turn the engine off instantly. That's the sort of functionality that we have with custom maps. We also can add a delay. So we say, okay, the map's going to become active. Let's wait 1 second before the map becomes active. These activation and deactivation delays are useful for things like fuel cuts, boost limits. And we also have to tell custom maps, we also have to tell ProECU when the custom map's allowed to work, which mode it's allowed to work in. If it's in debug, the map cannot work. You'll be able to log the output, but it will not physically do anything. So we need to uncheck debug, and we say we want this map to work in mode 1, 2, 3 and 4. But we might also say we only want this to work when the ESP is turned off. In this particular example, it wouldn't be a sensible choice, but we do have the control to say this is only allowed to work in certain modes. Okay, so there's a quick basic introduction to how custom maps is and how you can configure a custom map. Now on to the more detailed versions of more detailed examples of what you can do with custom maps. So custom maps, what can we do? We can create a closed loop target AFR on full load. The 370Z is open loop on full load. Doesn't matter what you put in the fuel map, you will not get it. We can create a target and an actual AFR set up so that we have closed loop on full load. On turbo cars, we can create closed loop boost control using integral and proportional error compensation. We can create a clever and adjustable traction control for a wheel slip differential. Custom maps enables us to do flex fuel tuning. We can import a flex fuel signal, a flex fuel sensor into the ECU. We can write fail-safe maps to protect the engine from dangerous conditions like running lean at high RPM, and we can hijack the oil temp gauge to display things like lambda, fuel trims, or we can just use it as an oil temperature gauge. So we have produced some example ROM files that are on EcuTek Update. You should have downloaded them and they'll be found in your 370Z folder. The first one that we're going to go through is documented in the 370Z tuning guide, and it's on page as I flick through the manual here, closed loop fueling is shown on page 47 of the tuning guide, and we're going to show you how to create a closed loop AFR target on full load and how to use proportional and integral compensations. So, page 47 of the tuning guide, section 5.8 defines how to create a closed loop fueling on full load, and the example ROM file found on EcuTek update has the map already created. So as we go through, custom map E, custom map F, define this control. So the ROM file we currently have open is the boost control and boost limit example ROM. So I'm just going to close that one. I don't want to save the changes I made. This is the traction control example ROM, and this is the closed loop fueling. So the example ROM is based on our European model 370Z, but you can copy and paste the changes into any of your 370Z or Infinity ROM files. Under the keying section, we've defined the custom maps that have been calibrated and what they're doing. These will cross-reference with the tuning guide and also obviously this webinar for future reference. So custom map E and F are the proportional and integral for closed loop fueling. So we go to custom maps, custom map E, and we open the notes and we can see custom map E is the proportional compensation for AFR error. X-axis is the AFR target and the Y-axis is the AFR average. So we open custom map E and we can see the X-axis is AFR error, so that's the difference between bank 1 and bank 2, and the Y-axis is the AFR average. So sorry, the Y-axis is the actual AFR coming from the sensors and the X-axis is the AFR target. So this is what's coming out of the fuel map. So on page 48 of the tuning guide, so X is the AFR target, so the target is 12 to 1. This comes out of our fuel map, and the current AFR coming from the factory AF sensors is 13 to 1. So the current AFR is leaner than our target. We have 13 to 1, we want 12 to 1, so the result, the output of the map, will be 1.05. You can see this column here is set to 1. Basically what's happening is if our target AFR is leaner than 14 to 1, then the closed loop control will not work. Obviously we have the factory AF control that will work in closed loop, but whenever we deviate from 14.7, around 14.5 from memory, the closed loop will go open loop, the short-term fuel trims will stop working, and then typically we're in open loop. With custom maps, we've only set up the closed loop control to start working between a target of 14 and 13.5 to 1. This is from trial and error and testing. We find that if we try to get the custom maps closed loop fueling working too quickly, that we can get some transition issues as we go in and out of factory closed loop and custom maps closed loop on load. So let me just check. So we've documented each map in the presentation. So custom map E is the closed loop AFR on full load, and the map output is a proportional addition, a multiplier, proportional multiplier to the fuel injector size. Okay, so when we go to map output, we can see that the output is injector pulse width and it will be multiplied. So in this particular instance, we can see the target AFR is 12 to 1, the actual AFR is 13 to 1, So the injector size will be multiplied by 1.05, which will open the injector for longer and make the car richer. So you can see from the activation for this closed loop fuel map to be allowed to work, it's based against engine load, and this custom map is only allowed to work when the engine load is above the threshold. So what is the threshold? The threshold is 65%. So whenever engine load is over 65%, the closed loop map's allowed to work, and whenever it's below 62%, it will not work. There is also a delay of 0.3 seconds before the map is allowed to work. Again, the map by default in the example ROMs is not enabled. If you want it to work, you disable the debug and you choose the map switch mode that you'd like it to work. So switching back to the presentation, custom map F is the closed loop AFR integral map. So these values are much smaller. So the proportional is a one-time only multiplication for a given AFR error. The map F is an integral map that will continually adjust the injector size output until you hit the target. So as we go to map F, again the values are much smaller because they're continuously added. They will continuously ramp up. Fewer significant points. Control Alt F will reduce the values, make it easier to see. And again you can see that between 13.5, 14 to 1, the closed loop fueling map, the integral map, will not be doing anything. Okay, so this is added to the pulse width, it's not multiplied. The x-axis is the target AFR and the y-axis is the average of what's coming out the factory AF sensors. And we also have an activation. So the map is only active when we're above the threshold, and the threshold again is engine load. So the map is only allowed to work, there's a delay of 0.3 seconds again before it becomes active, and it's 65% engine load. So the integral value again will only work over 65% engine load, and it will stop working when it's below 62% engine load. Most importantly on this map is the integral, because they're continuously added, they can ramp up or down in wanted conditions. So we can specify how far these maps can go, and the integral minimum and maximum being configured at 0.8 and 1.2. It's the maximum range that it's allowed to have, 20%. You will see on page 47 of the tuning guide. So this is where the engine load has been reduced by 10% in map switch mode 4, and you can see the mass airflow is consistent between both logs, but custom map F, the integral value, is ramped up to keep the AFR constant between both pulls despite the difference in engine load. So what we can see here is the difference between the two pulls. The AFR is very similar, 12.8, 12.9. AFR target, 12.89, 12.89. And the interim value is 6% on the first test, and it's 20%, 1.2 on the second test. But you can see that the engine load for the purpose of the test, initially it was 91%. We've calibrated it so it dropped to 80% to make the car run lean, but you can see the closed loop integral value is ramped in to correct the target AFR when map switch mode 4 is enabled, whereas previously it was map switch mode 3. but you can see the mass airflow reading is consistent between both runs, 174, 173, proving the car still had the same airflow. So we can see there when we affect the engine load on purpose, for the purpose of the test, that the closed loop fueling is just dialing in the AFR and hitting the target that the ECU has in the fuel map. So that's on page 47 of the 370Z tuning guide. Custom maps closed loop boost control. So closed loop boost control target, we have a target boost pressure, we have a wastegate duty, we have temperature compensation, and we have proportional and integral compensations. In the example ROM, which is on EcuTek update, the closed loop boost control is defined on page 51. And we can see custom map I has been configured. The x-axis is accel pedal, the y-axis is engine speed, and the output is a target boost pressure that will be stored as a calculation. It's boost pressure in bar, but it's just being stored. We need a target, we need a manifold pressure to aim for so that we can correct the pressure. Custom map J is a temperature compensation. The x-axis is coolant temperature, the y-axis is air temperature, and the output multiplies the current target boost pressure. So when the value is 1, the target boost pressure will not change. So between 60 degrees C and 110 C, and between 5 degrees intake air temp and 40 degrees intake air temp, the target boost pressure will not change. But should the coolant temperature be below 40 degrees or the air temperature be below 0 degrees, then the target value will be reduced accordingly. So here's a temperature compensation for coolant temp and air temp. This could be altitude, could be wheel slip. There's all sorts of things you could use here as a compensation. So custom map J is our compensation. Custom map K is our base wastegate duty. So now that we have a target pressure, we have a base wastegate duty. This particular slide I see isn't accurate, but the x-axis is actually the output of map I. So this is the target boost pressure, map I. It goes into the calculation, and then actually temperature compensation map J. So this is our final target boost pressure is map J. So map K, the input, the x-axis is the output of map J, calculation 1. The y-axis is actually engine speed. I need to update my slide. And the output is wastegate duty, which will actually be the CPC solenoid duty. So that's defined on page 52 of the tuning guide. Map L creates a boost error calculation. We know what the current pressure is and we know what our target is. If we compare the two, we get a differential pressure. So in the example on page 53 of the tuning guide, you will see at the top of page 53 that the x-axis is the actual boost pressure and the y-axis is the target pressure. The actual boost is 1.9, the target is 1.8. That gives us a pressure difference of 0.1 bar. So the output of the map would be 0.1 bar. So output of map L is boost error. Map M is our wastegate duty proportional compensation. So it compensates the wastegate duty for a given boost error. As we said, we have 1.9 bar absolute. We want 1.8 bar. So the difference is 0.1. The x-axis in this example is also wrong on the slide shown on the screen, but the x-axis for custom map M is boost error. Thankfully in the tuning guide it's correct, and x-axis is boost error. Let's swap. So page 53. So boost error. So the output of this map would be minus 8.3, and as it's a proportional map, if the current wastegate duty was 50% and we have a boost error of 0.1 bar, then 50% wastegate duty would be reduced to minus minus 8.3, so that would go from 50 down to 41.7. And you can see it's a minus 0.8, and the output of custom map would be to add the CPC, solenoid duty, which is our wastegate duty. We've got a wastegate solenoid plugged in the CPC valve, and it would reduce the wastegate duty from 50% to 42%, let's say. The next map is custom map N. Thankfully the X and Y axis are defined correctly this time, and you can see that the X axis is boost error and the Y axis is engine speed, and the output will be added as an integral to the CPC duty, i.e. wastegate duty. So if we're overboosting to 1.9 bar and we only want 1.8, we have a boost error of 0.1 bar, you can see that the wastegate duty will be reduced by minus 0.46%. So let's say minus 0.5. This calculation is added each time the ECU cycles. So very quickly, minus 0.05 will become a value of 1, and then minus 1, and then minus 2, minus 3, and it would like slowly reduce the wastegate duty. If we have a huge overboost, we have a very big value. If we have a small overboost, if we have a small underboost, the integral ramps up very slowly, very steadily. We don't want it increasing quickly because we can create an overboost. So custom map N is our integral. So if we go back and we open our boost control example ROM, and we go to custom map N, we can see the custom map N is only allowed to work against custom map L result. Custom map L is boost error, and the map's only active between the two threshold values. So the threshold is minus 2 and plus 2. So the integral is only allowed to work when the boost is within 0.2 bar of the target. This will stop the integral ramping up during offload conditions. It will only start to work when the target is near the actual. It's quite an important feature. You also see that the integral, it can remove 50% wastegate duty, but it's only allowed to add 10. Each time the map activates and deactivates, the integral will start from 0. So it can remove 50% wastegate duty, and it can add plus 10. We can also create a boost limit. Custom map O is our boost limit. The important thing to note here is the step value in the x-axis. X-axis is manifold absolute pressure, y-axis is engine speed, and the map values multiply the fuel injector size. So at 2 bar absolute, injector size is multiplied by 1, it doesn't change, but at 2.02 bar of boost pressure, it's multiplied by 0, instantly reducing the injector to 0, so shutting off the injectors basically. Okay, so that's defined on page 58 of the GTR of the 370Z tuning guide, and the important thing is the step value to ensure it's an instant fuel cut. We don't want to interpolate between 2 bar and 2.1 bar, so if we get 2.05 we're going to end up with injector size multiplied by 0.5, which would actually make the car go rich. Okay, next example. Custom maps traction control. Applying a torque reduction for a wheel speed differential. Low and high speed compensations can also be added. So with traction control, we've done two simple examples here that are on EcuTek update, and how we can use RaceROM to set up traction control. So for a given engine speed, the x-axis is RPM, engine speed, the y-axis is wheel slip ratio, how much wheel slip we actually have between the front and rear wheels. And the map output is ignition retard amount. So traction control is defined on page 56 of the tuning guide, and you'll see that custom map D, the output of the map is ignition timing, and it will add the retarded value depending on the engine speed and the wheel slip amount. Very simple map. Custom map E is a throttle traction control map. So same X and Y axis, engine speed versus wheel slip ratio, and it's a throttle multiplier. So the output of custom map E will close the throttle for a given wheel speed differential. It's a throttle multiplier. So when we go to custom map E, we can see at 5,000 RPM, 22% slip ratio, that the current throttle angle would be multiplied by 0.44. So it would be reduced by 60%. Output throttle target multiply. In custom map E notes, throttle multiply amount for wheel slip ratio. On the traction control, we can also put a weighting factor in. We can use a dash mounted potentiometer. We can import it through maybe a CPC voltage sensor. We can set up a weighting factor on the ignition retard or the throttle control, or both, for a given 0 to 5 volt input. So just like we can import the flex fuel sensor, we can import a potentiometer signal, and we can dial that up and down, where maybe at 0 volts none of the traction control maps work, and at 5 volts 100% of the maps work. This gives the driver control to be able to adjust the traction control himself. You could also put a weighting factor on per map switch mode, so you could set up a less aggressive traction control in mode 1 and a more aggressive traction control in mode 4, for example. It's very flexible, lots of things you can do with it. You can also put weighting factors in for vehicle speed, so as the car's going faster it has less an effect. Last thing you want on a 130 mile an hour bend is that the car just pulls all the power back and closes the throttle when the car starts to slip, whereas for start off you probably want to pull the torque right back to kill wheel spin, but at high speeds that might not be what you want to be doing. Fail-safe. So we can use custom maps to set up fail-safes. Fail-safe maps will protect the engine from running lean at high RPM. For example, we can close the throttle, we can reduce the boost pressure if the coolant, the oil temp, the air temperature becomes too high. We've have some example ROMs on EcuTek Update. Custom map G is for fail-safe AFR. Custom map G fail-safe AFR is shown on page 59 of the 370Z tuning guide. You can see the x-axis is AFR bank 1 and the y-axis is AFR sensor bank 2, and basically the step value again between 13 and 13.1. the output is the throttle multiplier, so anything, if the AFR on either bank is leaner than 13 to 1, then the throttle will be reduced. So we need some activation for this, because at transient conditions and part load we don't want this map working. So let's have a look. Custom map G failsafe. That's traction control. That's boost control. So the failsafe and gauge hijack are in the example ROM closed loop fueling, and failsafe AFR is custom map G. And we can see the map is only active when the engine load. Map is only active when the channel value is above the threshold. So let's see what the threshold is. Get the map open. So we have a 1 second delay for the activation, but the threshold is 120. So this is done for a forced induction car. Standard car run around 100% engine load for an NA car. At 120, this map will become active, and should the AFR over 0.2 bar of boost, let's say, for more than 1 second, should the AFR be leaner than 13 to 1, then the ECU will close the throttle. So the output is throttle target, and it's a multiplier. So this is a fail-safe AFR. So you could do that against RPM, you could say high RPM, you could do it against throttle position, Probably not. You'd want a bigger, you could do it against manifold pressure, so only high boost pressure that it's checking, but the delay period is quite important. We want the AFR, the reading from the AF sensors, to be steady, and we don't want to be thinking that just because the AFR changes quickly that we close the throttle. So that's fail-safe AFR when we're leaner than 13:1. With the fail-safes, we can also do other fail-safes for coolant temp, oil temp. You know, as we say, the oil temp gets too hot, coolant temp gets too hot. We can protect the engine, let's say. There's many things we can do. Oil temp gauge hijack. So this is quite tricky to set up, but we can drive the oil temp gauge. We can do it during map switch mode all the time, and we can show AFR, lambda, fuel trims, or boost pressure. We can also show the traction control settings or boost target. Now the fail-safes are, the gauge hijacks, sorry, are defined on page 57. And we've configured in the example one, custom map E is an oil temp gauge hijack for AFR. So because the gauge doesn't show 13.5, but it does show 130, we have to use our imagination for looking at the AFR. So our oil temp gauge goes up to 150. So with lambda 1, 14.7, 147 on the gauge is indicating 14.7. In this particular instance, we have bank 1 AF sensor on the x-axis and bank 2 AF sensor on the y-axis, and the table has been calibrated so that it will always report the leaner AFR. In this instance, bank 2 is 12:1, bank 1's 13:1. The output would be 13:1, showing the leaner of the two AFRs. And custom map E has been output to display on the oil temp gauge. So that's shown on page 57. Gauge hijack. On page, the AFR hijack is actually on page 58 of the tuning guide. Custom map I enabled in mode 4. AFR shown on the oil temp gauge in mode 4. The output of the map is calculation 2, and it will be replaced so it's stored correctly. Bank 1 is the x-axis and bank 2 is the y-axis. So custom map H is the short-term fuel trim. So oil temp gauge hijack. Custom map H shows fuel trim. So x-axis is short-term fuel trim bank 1, y-axis is bank 2, and the output is stored as calculation 1. Remember that map I is stored as calculation 2. Okay, so the output of this map is the short-term fuel trim. When the fuel trims are 100%, the oil temp gauge will read 100. When the fuel trims are 115, the oil temp gauge will read 115. But if bank 1's 15, 115, and bank 2 is 100, it will read the higher value. So it will always show where it's adding the most fuel trims. So custom map H is short-term fuel trim. Custom map I is AFR. And custom map J decides which two of these to use. So it's been enabled in mode 3 and mode 4. And this defines if the fuel trim short term or AFR is shown on the oil temp gauge. So as we come down, custom map H is the x-axis and custom map Y, and y-axis is the output of custom map I. So as we look at custom map J, it's quite unusual because the decision is whether it's displaying H, the fuel trim, or I, the AFR. And depending on which map switch mode is enabled, because custom map H is enabled in mode 3 and I is enabled in mode 4, it will only display one of the outputs. So this way we can control the oil temp gauge to show either of the two hijacks. So that's defined on page 58 of the tuning guide. So H is the short-term fuel trim, I is the AFR hijack, and J decides which one of the two maps is displayed on the oil temp gauge. So that brings me to the end of the custom map section. Further information about the 370Z product is available on our 370Z fact sheet and all our other fact sheets, and they're available for download on the marketing page of our website, EcuTek.com. If you'd like a copy of the 370Z tuning guide or the custom maps manual, please email us at support@EcuTek.com. We can send you a copy through to show you the product in more detail. Hopefully the webinar has given you a good overview of how the product works. We appreciate your participation, and we hope to see you at the next EcuTek webinar.